our viewers. We're starting our program critically and freely conducted by Gintautas Mažeikis and me, Tomas Kavaliauskas from Vytautas Magnus University. We're senior researchers who are interested today to conduct a conversation with our special guest, Niklas Bernsand from Lund University, Sweden, who is an expert on Ukraine, and he's a Slavist. And we would like to talk to him today about geopolitical situation in Europe, Russian and Ukrainian tensions. However, we would like to start from a little bit of background, history, and certain divisions. So, Professor Gintautas, would you like to ask Niklas the first question?
Thank you, Thomas. Nice to see you, Niklas. And my first question, that contemporary listeners of medias, ordinary accepts or rejects, the idea of separation of Ukraine, And ordinary Putinist propaganda says that, look, there is West Ukraine and East Ukraine. Sometimes he calls this West Ukraine as Galicia, But in any way, how it's important for history and contemporary Ukraine, this separation of two parts?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I will say that even also in Swedish media, that would be one of the most common stereotypes, so to speak, about Ukraine. If people know something about Ukraine, they will probably mention this, that you have Western Ukraine and then you have Eastern Ukraine. So if you allow me to start from a kind of a meta perspective and then evolve into a more factual aspect, right? I mean, in Ukraine, in Ukrainian studies and so on, there has been much talk, obviously, during the last 30 years about this division. Some people have emphasized its existence. Other people have said that it's really not such a big division. And I mean, one of the most important starting points would be probably Mykola Repchuk's article about two Ukraines from the 1990 something. Well, we're claiming then that we have a Western Ukraine and we have an Eastern Ukraine. Then you had various answers to that. For example, there was one answer that pointed out that why not 22 Ukraines then? Because you can always find various kinds of division in any country that you could define in such a way. Then, if you remember, already after the Orange Revolution, like 2004-5, there were some people claim that now this successful revolution shows that all this talk about Eastern and Western Ukraine, it's an exaggeration. In reality, there is one Ukraine with some differences, but there is one Ukraine. Then quickly some other people began to argue that after all we cannot ignore the division. There is a division, but then again, and I think that's correct. I mean, you have real differences between various parts of Ukraine that sometimes are quite significant. One question you should start with is but what does that mean? If you have Western and Eastern Ukraine, you have to have some kind of a boundary. So where would that boundary be? And if you're talking in kind of political terms, if you look, for example, at how people have voted in the various presidential elections, parliamentary elections, you will see that there is a certain moment for example, to the eastwards. For example. So if you believe in this clear division between the Western and Eastern Ukraine, then Western Ukraine has become somewhat bigger during those 30 years. So it's also a matter then of what would be Western Ukraine, and you could look at contemporary politics, or you can look at various historical points and concepts to define this. Then again, you can ask yourself, is West and Eastern Ukraine really the most relevant? Maybe you should look at various regions inside, for example, Western Ukraine, where you have huge differences between, let's say, Galicia, as you mentioned, right, and then you have Zakarpattia, Transcarpathia. If you look, for example, to the extent that people in those regions vote for, so to speak, national candidates in say, patriotic, to use a more neutral word, candidates in various presidential and parliamentary elections, you will see that in Galicia, people indeed would vote in the way you would expect them, right? And while in Transcarpathia, it depends very much on the locality. In some parts, people will vote for the same candidates. In other parts, those candidates don't really have more support than they would have in what would be called Eastern Ukraine. So there are big differences inside those kind of macro regions. The reason for that we talk about them, or that they formed in, if we want to pick up some reality, something specific about this, is that, well, different parts of Ukraine formed part of different empires historically, and what we would habitually call Western Ukraine, or the most specific regions, were part of Poland, Lithuania, Poland, Austria, Hungary, and mostly Austria in the case of Transcarpathia, Hungary, right? And because of this, they had a certain kind of development. If you take Galicia, as mentioned, or Bukovina for that matter, those regions never were controlled by Moscow. They were never governed by Moscow until 1939, the autumn of 1939. While, for example, another important region in what is now habitually Western Ukraine, was Volhynia, was indeed a part of the Russian Empire until 1918. Then, when it, after the First World War, it became, after all the wars and turbulence, it became a part of Poland, which is important if you talk about national identities, conflicts, and how those things develop. While Ukraine, to the east of a certain line, was part of the Russian Empire, it was part of the Tsarist Empire until the revolution, and in many cases continuously, with the exceptions of the revolutionary years, maybe, where you had chaos and different efforts of state building. So I think the divisions are rooted historically in various state belongings, which brought with them different preconditions for example, the creation of a national movement. It was easier to develop, say, an infrastructure for in support of the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian activism, ethnic activism in Austria than it was in Russia, for example. So we had a lot of, say, interreferences between those regions, but I think that would be one of the reasons, at least.
Yeah, Niklas, you understand that this question is important because, you know, Russia declares that if the military conflict will start, they would like to take the eastern part. You know, ordinarily they consider this eastern part as not only Donbass, but as well Dnipropetrovsk or Dnipro now, or Kharkov, you know, or even South Ukraine, Odessa. You know, they consider it so-called east bank of Dnieper. You know, and the question is, you know, is really this part Eastern? I mean, Eastern in Russian sense that Eastern for them means pro-Russian, you know.
Well, I mean, there are. It's a good question. There are various ways of starting to explain this. If you, for example, talk about pro-Russian as a very explicit kind of Russian nationalist support, then that has been low historically in those regions. Even in Crimea, such parties before 2014 got no more than about 10% of the vote. Like the Ruski Bloc, for example, in Crimea. In Donbass, they got even less. I don't remember the exact numbers, but significantly less than they got in Crimea. And the support in the other provinces that you mentioned were negligible. There were no active Russian separatism, pro-Russian separatism in those regions before 2014. I would say that in those regions, in Donbass and in those parts of Donbass which is still controlled by Ukraine, you will find certain elements of certain pro-Russian sentiments among the population, or at least some kind of hesitation about the Ukrainian state, about the Ukrainian authorities, the Ukrainian army, and so on. It's difficult for me to say exactly how widespread it is, but it certainly is there, and it's massive enough, I would say. In other regions, you will find different attitudes, but I would say my understanding is that there is no mass level sympathy for some kind of affiliation with Russia of any kind that would be relevant for the present situation in, say, Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipro, and so on. Because we are after the annexation of Crimea and after the events in Donbass. The war in Donbass. Being pro-Russian is not an abstraction. Before 2014, we could have talked about this on different levels. You can be pro-Russian in various ways. But when you ask about being pro-Russian now, it means that you would have sympathy for the Russian state that is conducting those very policies. And you will not talk about sympathies for the Russian language. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about a certain view of the past where you would be more or less in line with various old Soviet versions. I'm not talking about that. Being pro-Russian now would be to be in support, more or less, or being okay with being neutral to even the activities of the Russian state today. Yeah, in that sense, I don't believe that you would find some kind of majority support for this in those provinces.
Thank you. The other accusation of Moscow for Ukraine is in fascism. That's ordinary when we are looking to Russian channels, including highest representatives and Putin. Ordinary, they accuses, if not all Ukrainians, a part of them into fascism or sympathies to fascism, and they do references to the Bandera or so-called Banderovцы. But that this is quite important to explain for Lithuanian and Baltic people, because we understand differently that Banderovцы, because for example Lithuania so-called Green Brothers, or if you will take for example Serbs or Croatia, it's Ustasha, Chetniks. Everywhere was not so simple, How do you explain this phenomenon of Banderovцы, how it's important for the Western Ukraine or Ukrainian identity, or is this just some Kremlin's fear, Kremlin's imaginary?
It's all of those things, I suppose. The phenomenon grew out of conditions in Western Ukraine, basically ethnic strife, but in Poland between the Polish government and Ukrainian nationalists. A large part, at least, of Ukrainian society, that part that choose not to emphasize civil relations and democratic participation, but to fight in other ways. So from that surroundings and from other kinds of diaspora activities, those organizations gradually took form, and there were military action already earlier in this way. After the outbreak of the Second World War, after the Soviet invasion of Poland, of the Ukrainian and Belarusian provinces, after the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union, of course, those activities intensified in various ways, and those units, by some Ukrainians, local Ukrainians, came to be seen as defenders of, say, Ukrainian peasants against, for example, Soviet collectivization or Soviet authorities. Simultaneously, they took part in various atrocities, and you can say crimes. They were involvement of some of those units in the Holocaust, in the kill. This is not an invention by Putin. It's true. There were involvement of those units in the ethnic cleansing of Poles in Volhynia in 1942-43. So that actually happens. So the units are problematic from a historical perspective. On the other hand, this is of course maximally used by the Russian side to pinpoint any kind of Ukrainian independentism, basically, as politically, morally hesitant, morally doubtful, and they play this card maximally, and they often exaggerate. In Ukraine, I would say that this is an important memory for some. It's regionally an important memory. It's if you, for example, look at opinion polls, and if you look at memories of Holodomor, the big famine in the 1930s, you can see that gradually there seemed to be a kind of unification where Eastern Ukrainian public opinion are closing up with Western and Central Ukrainian political opinions. When it comes to Bandera, it's not that clear. You still have a regional tendency that this is important for many people, not all obviously, but many people in the western parts, meaning basically mostly Galicia and Volhynia, most importantly, because that's where most of the fighting took place. While there's been some changes in direction of more positive attitudes in eastern and southern parts, but not to the same extent, and there is still, I think, a great degree of hesitancy about those figures in eastern Ukraine. So I think in Western Ukrainian memory culture, in official memory culture, for example, those heroes that we for them play a significant role. If you go to Lviv, you will see, and you go to the center from the railway station, you look to the right, and like in 2 minutes you have a huge Bandera statue, for example, would be one of the first things you see if you know where to look. Just one example. I don't hear you. Your mic.
Yeah, let's go to more contemporary issues. About new challenges. It's about Maidan, first of all. You know that from the one side, Maidan, European, the first Maidan 2004, and the second Maidan 2013 and 14, so-called Euromaidan, became some symbol of, Ukrainian independence, like Sąjūdis in Lithuania, that's, I would say that very similar symbols. And many of groups try to privatize this memory of Maidanian, revolution, and then many of contemporary political parties would like to use this instrument for the pressure on the Rada or the government, try to sometimes to organize some nationalist movements, and we could understand sometimes that it's some sort of instability in Ukraine, and this instability as well is sometimes could be explained by the spirit of Maidan. But is it really these protests, or Maidanian activism, is it really the weakness of Ukraine? Or it's like democracy or development of contemporary democracy? How do you think about it?
Well, it's you can look at it in both ways, I think, obviously. Maybe the first thing that should be said here for the context is that what happened to what happened after the change of government in early 2014, when the war in Donbass broke out and so on. That there was indeed a huge gathering of those forces that you mentioned in Kyiv at that time, and they, of course, potentially could have put a lot of weight and pressure on the various institutions in Kyiv. say, corrupt institutions with a lot of people who you can say have limited credibility in the new situation. Then the war broke out, and one of the things that happened was that a lot of those activists, especially the strongest one, the young males, people ready to fight, they left Kiev and moved to the front. Many of them died on the front, among the first people to die. So in a way, when the war started, this energy that you basically are talking about was diffused to some degree by the actual war. So here you have an immediate connection between the weakening of revolutionary energy and the Russian annexation and military policies, right? So that's, I think here you have, that's also a part of the game. Crimea is not only Crimea, and Donbass is not only Donbass. Then once again, of course, in a situation where, at first, what were the situation? The Ukrainian army was not in a good shape. You probably remember, right? So what happened was that Ukraine was basically armed from below, to some extent from below, to some extent from oligarchs and from private pockets of various kinds. Oligarchs who had also deep personal interests in financing effective forces to stop these rebellions. There were, I remember living in Ukraine in 2015-16, everywhere in churches and in other places you had, they were collecting of money for the army, and to a large extent the Ukrainian army was put up from below by civil society. And also in the start, a lot of the most effective battalions were not officially part of the Ukrainian army. They were kind of voluntary battalions, some of them with some political inclinations that have been controversial. And I mean, this is then basically with time, most of those formations became incorporated in the Ukrainian army. But still, if you have this situation with comparatively weak institutions, and you have a situation where many people, men and women, have experience from the front and can be frustrated with what they would see maybe as defeatist positions, or as it could be corruption, it could be various things. Then those people have actual experience using money, and you can also perhaps see that in some cases maybe you can find some chains of financing that also would be relevant for the larger political games. Then it's not that easy to say, is this a strength or is it a weakness? In a way, it's a weakness, because Ukraine needs better institutions. Ukraine needs better functioning institutions. In that case, from that perspective, it's definitely a weakness. On the other hand, the only thing that has propelled corrupt bureaucracies and dormant civil servants, government officials, to do something has been the threat of the street gathering, right? So in that sense, it's also a potential. So it's both a threat, I think, and a potential. That's maybe a vague answer, but I think you have to keep both options in mind.
Would you agree, Niklas, that Maidan and Euromaidan at first, then Maidan revolution was in 2014 actually the shifting point when Ukraine geopolitically shifts towards European Union, to the West, away from Russia, talking geopolitically, and ever since Russia has been trying to organize these regional military conflicts in order to create Ukraine as what Jacques Rupnik would call failed state or failing democracy state, unstable, therefore incompetent to become a NATO member, incompetent to become a EU member, therefore creating something like never completed transformation to full democracy is beneficial for Russia, and this has been the politics ever since Maidan. Would you agree with that concept that Ukraine is the target for Russia as a failed state?
I see your point. To begin with, well, I mean, indeed, the victory of the Maidan was a big step in moving Ukraine more clearly to the west. That's obvious. The second big step was, of course, Russia's actions. I mean, there was never a clear majority among Ukrainian citizens for joining NATO, for example, until Russian annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of war in Donbass. I mean, in that sense, you have, of course, you have the Maidan, yes, but you also have the war in Donbass, and in this way, Russia itself created a Ukraine that really seeks no other alternatives but the West. Before 2013, I mean 14, it would have been difficult to convince a lot of Ukrainians of the necessity of joining joining NATO. Now people would see that we have no choice. So it's created by, this turn has been created by the change of elites after the victory of the Maidan, and by the policies of the aggression of Russia, which has forced Ukraine to seek protection where they can find protection. If they can find protection, we should add. Then I think you are right that it's in the interest of Russia now to project an image of Ukraine as a failed state. It also in the interest of Russia that Ukraine actually would be as weak as possible. Right? I yes, basically I agree with you that this is indeed in that interest.
However, if the war starts, I don't know to what extent you accept the degree of danger now that the world leaders are talking about. Russian army is at the borders of Ukraine. In any case, the threat is there. And if the war starts, then the perpetrator becomes more than obvious for the
Yes.
For us, it's been obvious ever since Maidan. But however, for some naive Westerners, the perpetrator would become way too obvious. Wouldn't that be something against Russia? What is your interpretation in case Russia does decide to invade Ukraine like full screen? Wouldn't it be against the Kremlin's all the intentions? Because then Russia would be singled out like an obvious evil maker.
Yeah, but if Russia does invade, then of course it's all cards on the table. So, but I mean, if Russia would choose to invade, then they have already stopped caring about what people think. I mean, they would already be past that point. So they would then consider that military means would be to their interest. Whatever would happen in terms of economic sanctions, cut off from SWIFT, or problems for the Nord Stream pipeline, if that would happen, as the new German government says it might be the case. So if they choose to invade, they have left. I think they would have left all such considerations behind. Yeah.
Many of us, we imagine a very classical form of warfare, that's Second World War, front lines, tanks, battalions, this, it looks like from old fairy tale, because contemporary Russian aggressions, if you will take Georgia, Sakartvelo, or this Donbassian case, all this aggression looks completely differently. It's not about front line. It looks like a very dirty, a human hybrid with human resources, money, corruption, creation of civic chaos, development of this civic chaos. And how do you think about this possibility, not about military aggression, which is, many of European politicians thinks about it, but about this organizing of chaos in some parts of Ukraine as some element of warfare?
Yeah, I think basically those things are happening all the time, I suppose. There are constant, of course, Russia tries to influence the Ukrainian society in various ways. And of course, what happened during the so-called Russian Spring was that the so-called Russian Spring indeed was exactly that kind of manipulations. They succeeded in the Donbass. They succeeded in Crimea. They failed in Kharkiv. They failed in Dnipro. They failed in Odessa, and so on. So I think indeed that that would be some kind of alternative, but would they? I doubt that they would be very successful without the support from armed forces of Russia, because in this time, this is not 2014. People have seen what has become with the so-called People's Republics in the East, right? And that's not dreamland for many people. That's not the situation maybe where you would like to find yourself, your street, your city, your family, and so on, right? So I think the actual events of 2014 and the war that has been after that do not really show that as a kind of successful independent strategy. I would imagine that in connection with the Russian invasion, they would do various kinds of sabotage and disturbances, absolutely, but not maybe not as an independent strategy at this age. That would be my guess.
Yeah, I think so. The same, sabotage could be used as military instrument, chaos and sabotage. It's quite understandable, but look about Western countries, and their solidarity with Ukraine. Ordinarily, they would like to solidarize only on this front line. I think, okay, the ordinary say looks military troops of Russia on the borders of Ukraine, you see the new dangerous attack and so on. But ordinarily, when we start to discuss some chaos in some regions of Ukraine, we accuse this Ukrainian government. We say that you don't see possibilities, you couldn't find means how to regulate your civic life. And so this is, it looks like, that Western countries and maybe in Ukraine are not ready to collaborate on the civic level, I would say, in order to develop some civic security in these dangerous or more threatful regions, and ordinary pays the only attention to this military issue, when Russia pays more attention to organizing of sabotage and civic chaos.
Yeah, it might be the case. I think there's much to say about various Western attitudes and the actions of various European countries. Germany, I would probably say, in the first hand. It can be the case. To my knowledge, the most important actor in that respect would be the Ukrainian civil society. There's a lot of activities, there has been since 2014 on the front line, in the areas close to the front in those parts of eastern Ukraine. A lot of people moving in from other parts of Ukraine to take part in various supporting activities and so on. Some of that might be supported by various European money, European sources. But I think you may be right about that. I think the most dangerous for Ukraine in this regard are probably when the realpolitik of certain European countries come into conflict with declarations of support for Ukraine. I mean, the Nord Stream pipeline should be the most obvious example, I suppose.
Yeah, because many of us, we consider that some Western countries, not only Western countries, but even from the so-called Warsaw, camp, this group, of Central Eastern European countries, not always are united about some questions, and some of them could even support Nord Stream 2, as for example, like in Lithuania with this endless conflict with Belarus Kali in Belarus, because when Lithuania would like to stop on the EU level, some of countries ordinarily block these all solutions, because they have an interest into income, in the profit, and Nord Stream has as well interest in profit. And this profit interest means that the Western countries, it's easy to buy some Western countries, than to fight. And this corruption, what does it mean for the Ukraine fate, for the Ukraine destiny?
Well, I think it's worrisome. Firstly, I suppose you're talking about Hungary, for example. In that case, I mean, the Hungarian government have. There have been various utterances during the years from the Hungarian side about Zakarpattia, about the Hungarian minority there, and there have been some fears of Hungarian interest in those regions and so on, and some doubts about what would happen in case of and so on. So I think you have that problem, but on the other hand, this is related to this general conflict inside the European Union when Poland and Hungary, and recently most clearly Poland, has shown that they would emphasize their own independence before the decisions associated to the EU decisions. And then in that case, sometimes we hear the argument from kind of centrist European forces that Hungary and Poland and so on are risky, or behave in a risky way because they undermine the unity of the European Union, for example, in the face of a common Russian threat. Which, I mean, there would be some points here regarding Hungary, maybe. Regarding Poland, I think not. But on the other hand, if you look at what's really happening, the most important thing here is Nord Stream, and the main actor here, of course, is Germany. So even if Hungary and Poland behaved perfectly, coordinated everything with Brussels and Strasbourg, you still wouldn't have this kind of common front because it's undermined by German business. So I think one could also take that perspective.
I'm so eager, Niklas, to ask you a taboo question here in Lithuania, which is the question of Crimea. In Lithuanian media and on the top official level, it is unequivocally evil thing that Crimea has been occupied since 2014, taken away from Ukraine, and the sovereignty, unity of sovereign country of Ukraine has been violated.
Yeah.
On the other hand, keeping in mind that certain political, cultural behavior would not be imagined somewhere in Ukraine, like in Galicia, for example, to celebrate May 9th as the Victory Day. In Galicia, there would be no such celebration. in Crimea, people do celebrate this military celebration of Victory Day against fascism, in particular against fascism. And for instance, when train tracks were made from St. Petersburg all the way to Sevastopol, people were dancing on the streets with Soviet military uniforms, wearing all the medals that they are connected with the mainland of Russia. And I wonder to what extent the population in Crimea is actually satisfied being a part of Russia. Of course, I do understand that Kremlin most likely invested much more into Crimea at the beginning of occupation in order to make the image for itself as a caring Kremlin, ignoring perhaps the needs of other Russian regions, investing into Crimea as a kind of resort, exclusive resort region. Perhaps now there are much less investments. However, there's the bridge. There's the train now direct to St. Petersburg. What do you think about the actual facts there in Crimea? Because we do understand that this is a violation of international law, but looking at this not from that perspective, but what is inside there, isn't it really a reconnection with the mainland?
Basically, I think what you're asking me about the public opinion in Crimea, how people in Crimea look at this. It's difficult for me to say. I mean, it's not a situation where it is easy to conduct credible opinion polls. Actually, not so long time ago, I read an article. It was a researcher from America who made opinion polls in Crimea in 2011, a few years before all those events. And he found a certain support for unification with Russia. Then that was a very hypothetical question, right? Among ethnic Russians of Crimea. No support at all among Crimean Tatars. Crimean Tatars are almost 100% against connections with Russia. Many of them have fled to mainland Ukraine. Many live in Lviv and in Kyiv right now. And the Tatar opinion is absolutely anti-Russian, to my knowledge. This is about something like 12-15% of the population in Crimea. After that's the amount of people that have returned from the place, Central Asia, to which they were deported in the 1940s. The Ukrainian community in that survey was divided. Most people were not in favor of some kind of unification with Russia. So I would imagine that, as I said before, there was no active political separatism on a very significant level in 2013-14. It was not that people just sat in their homes and waited for Russia to take over, but I mean, you had a certain amount of local people, mostly Russians to some extent, some of the Ukrainians, who might have looked favorably if Russia, or might have believed also that Russia would mean better pensions, better quality of life, more roads, better roads, and so on and so on. So situationally, I mean, there might have been some support, although it's absolutely impossible to say to what extent this is. Afterwards, as you had said, there were initially a lot of investment, the bridge you mentioned, and a lot of other things. Much less so now, as you said. You should not forget also that there is a large amount of pressure. Basically, everyone has been forced to accept Russian citizenship. If you didn't accept it, you would risk being stripped of your property, for example, your house or your whatever it was. So okay, they have train connection to St. Petersburg, but on the other hand, you cannot fly to Europe. You can only fly to Russia. Earlier, you could fly to various countries, and you cannot anymore. There are also practical minuses. Secondly, water. Crimea is dependent upon water supplies from Kherson Oblast in Ukraine. And Ukraine obviously doesn't feel that it has the obligation to provide this annexed territory with water. There will be practical pluses and minuses also for the inhabitants of Crimea now, but I don't dare to speculate on the actual opinion, except for the Crimean Tatars. That case is absolutely clear, I would say.
Yeah, on the other hand, Crimea has become, especially keeping in mind the military seaport, Sevastopol, that now there's so much tension in the Black Sea between NATO forces and Russia, and we had not too long ago this incident with the British Navy. Yeah. Do you see Crimea now turning its image perhaps from exclusive resort territory into geopolitical, strategic kind of big castle for Russia to position its navy fighting for the influence in the Black Sea? Because we have Turkey on the other coast, we have Romania and Bulgaria, NATO countries on the other coast. It seems like there's a big battle, especially if to compare to the Baltic Sea. There would be some differences, I think. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, ever since the Russian takeover of Crimea in 1783, and continuing in the 19th century, you had this dual aspect. On the one hand, the military factor was there. I mean, the military base in Sevastopol is from Tsarist times, and also during between the end of the Soviet Union in 2014, Russia had, as you said, this naval base, and the naval base had this function that you mentioned already back then. But on the other hand, also starting from Tsarist times, you have this image of Crimea as a resort, as a paradisic place for people who own country houses there and so on, and that also continued during Soviet times and during the first decades of Ukrainian independence. So I will say, especially in this situation, I mean, obviously the military aspects predominate. It cannot be otherwise. Since the situation is kind of intense, it's not resolved. The NATO forces have to show some presence in order not to mark this maritime territory as kind of a Russian interest. So in the present situation, and also keeping in mind that, I mean, for example, Western tourists will not go to Crimea. Some went to Crimea earlier, but that doesn't happen now. Crimea is shut off from this. So in that case, it's kind of inevitable that the military aspects take the upper hand, I think.
Yeah. Perhaps Professor Mažeikis would like to ask one more question before I ask the last question for our meeting.
Yeah, because we're talking about Crimea, and Tomas mentioned Turkey's position, and you mentioned about Crimea Tatars, you know, and now I know that Kiev would like to play some games with Turkey regarding to Crimea future, you know. Mm-hmm. This not all these games are not clear, but as I understand, Kiev looking for some coalition, more or less strong military coalition, and they are searching for the solution of Crimea question. Because if we will react on your answer and Thomas' question, we could think that, okay, all the problems are solved, now it's completely Russia territory, but it's not. It looks that it's not so, because Tatars would like another solution. Kiev would like as well, and we see new player. It's Turkey. What's your opinion about Turkey and Tatars and Turkey interests about Crimea?
I mean, from the Tatars' perspective, the idea is that for them the first real difficult blow was the deportation in 1944. It was almost every single Tatar was deported, mostly to Uzbekistan, right? They wasn't allowed to return until the late 1980s, and then 2014 will be the second blow. So in that case, as far as I understand, we have this axis of Ukraine and the Crimean Tatars, and also already in the 1990s, in the 2000s, the Crimean Tatars were the best ally for Kiev in Crimea, not the local Ukrainian community, but the Crimean Tatars, because they had common interest. Call it double post-colonialism or whatever you would like, because they had common interest in that. And after the annexation, the communities, exile communities of Tatars in Lviv and Kiev worked very strongly with Ukraine. And Ukraine tries to take into account Tatar interest and the Tatar factor when they are talking about the situation abroad. Remember that Kiev sent the Jamala, the singer, for example, to the Eurovision in 2016. That's just one example. I can also tell you my impressions living in Lviv for a long time, a few years ago, that if you have like two refugee groups in the cities, you have the Crimean Tatars on the one hand, then you have Russians and Ukrainians, Russian speakers from Donbass. With one of those groups, the relations were excellent, and I think they still are. That's with the Tatars. The Tatars were considered friends of Ukrainians. People massively went to their cafes, their restaurants, and tried to support Tatars as best as they could. There were, I remember, exhibitions about Tatars in the local historical museums in Galicia, for example. While there were some animosity occasionally with people coming in from the Donbass, who were accused of buying up the apartments and whatever you want. And at the center here, obviously, is this feeling of loyalty. The Tatars are loyal, and we have common interest, while the people from Donbass may be different kinds of people. And I think that in terms of Ukrainian Tatar alliance, that alliance is alive and kicking. What would happen in case of miraculous Russian retreat from Crimea? It's difficult to say. If you look at, for example, at the memory loss of 2014, you can see that there has been this official change of toponymy, and of course Ukraine does not control Crimea at the moment, but you can see that a lot of place names in Crimea, Russian, Soviet, were changed back into Tatar names, for example. That would give some implications of how this alliance looks at this certain stage. What would happen in case of a real Ukrainian return of Crimea? It's difficult to say. Turkey, I mean, I'm not an expert on Turkey. As far as I understand, Turkey considers itself a big regional player, not only on that front, but also in the Caucasus, in the Middle East, in Syria, and so on. And they have difficult relations with Russia on all those fronts, right? So then Crimea would be yet another vector, and it's more like a passive vector, as far as I see. It's not, I mean, there is a moral support. You have, since the 19th century, you have a large Crimean Tatar community in Turkey, something like 150,000 if you count only the most intense circle, right? If you talk about people, Turks who have some degree of ancestry will have probably millions of people. So I mean, you have this factor, but there are like some factors that are keeping Russia and Turkey in some kind of strategic partnership, and there are some factors that will keep them as competitors. And I think it's difficult to see right in this at this moment that that Turkey could do so much with Crimea. that would have to be further in the future when other things already happen in the Caucasus and in Syria.
Yeah, but Niklas, here what was in your answer, I just would like to repeat for our listeners that there are hundreds of thousands of Crimea Tatars now in Turkey, and they have completely right for their, neighbor lands or for the history, and they are looking as well for the for the historical justice, I would say, and they are not happy from all this what is going. And ordinary, when we accept that Crimea, it's then that all the questions are just is solved about Crimea. No, at all.
It's not.
Because there are very big groups of Tatars, in different countries, especially in Ukraine and Turkey, who pretend to return back, to their lands of their ancestors. I thank you, Thomas, please.
I would like to ask the last question before we end our program today. You are teaching in Sweden, and a very kind of, to some extent, exotic subject, Ukrainian studies. What are your students? I mean, who are your students? And what seduces a Swedish student? Perhaps it's a multicultural group, maybe it's not Swedish only. What seduces them to take studies into Ukrainian studies, probably under large umbrella of Slavic studies, but I'm shifting slightly under advice of Professor Mažeikis. What is the Nordic perspective? How do you see from the other side of the Baltic Sea that part of Europe, Eastern European world, Ukraine?
Well, I mean, starting with a smaller perspective, which is my courses, then you can say that we have one course now about Ukraine and Belarus together, and here we have a certain number of students, open also for international students. It's held in English, so we have mostly Swedish students. We have one woman from Estonia, for example, and we have one woman from Germany. But basically we have Swedish students. Then we have another course, general about memory politics in the post-Soviet states, including then Russia, then Central Asia and the Caucasus. And here we have a guy from Georgia, for example, and we have a girl from Russia. So we have, apart from the Swedish students. So you're right that we have a more kind of multicultural audience in that sense. Well, people take those courses for various reasons. Mostly see them as add-ons to what I already have. Maybe they have some kind of political science as a major, or let's say sociology or something like that, and they would like to have some courses that add some kind of spice to their diplomas in that way. So you can of course play with the exoticism label here in that sense. It's unavoidable in a sense, right? So that would be one reason. I think earlier, I mean, traditionally, considering the history of Sweden, I mean, it has been in our national interest to have some degree of professional knowledge about Russia, the Russian Empire, and what happens there, because for obvious reasons, it's a neighbor that we have contacts with in various ways, and that we should know something about. So historically, you would have that factor as well. I would believe that kind of thinking, unfortunately, is undermined with this transnational tendencies in education and so on. But earlier, at least, it was there. So generally, how Swedes look at Ukraine, for example, it's difficult to say. I mean, if you go back 30 years, not all Swedes would have heard of Ukraine at all. then many of those who had heard of it would say that it's somewhere in Russia, right? Probably, I mean, I think it was one of the great accomplishments then of Ukrainian independence. You can say a lot of bad things about the effectiveness of state institutions in Ukraine and what has been done, the corruption and whatever you want, the usual things, you know. But time in this sense works for Ukraine. As Ukraine participates in sport competition, in music competitions, as people go themselves to Eastern Europe, to Ukraine, I mean, as long as a country produces, you know, stamps or whatever you want, then the country participates in various contexts. Then the fact of its existence gets established little by little every day. You know, and you have, you know, exchange students from Ukraine who proudly represent Ukraine, and you know, so you build subjectivity of this previously not very subjective in Swedish eyes country, you know, every day. So I would say it's much better. It's incomparably better than it was not so long time ago. And you know, people know that there is a war going on. People would mainly, I think, automatically almost take the Ukrainian side, with the exceptions of, you know, the usual people, you know, very far right wingers or very far left wingers, right?
You know, what I find funny is when there's European football championship, and Ukraine is playing, because they're wearing blue and yellow colors, t-shirts with those colors. If I didn't look at the name of the national team, you could think, oh, maybe it's Sweden that is playing.
Yeah, but even Ukraine actually played against Sweden in the latest championships. So if you saw it, you were probably very confused. Yes.
Yeah, which team is which?
Yes.
So wonderful. Thank you, Niklas, for such a vivid and energetic your sharing knowledge. Because I know you wrote your doctoral dissertation in Ukraine. What was the region that you were stationed there?
Well, my dissertation is not yet publicly defended, but it will be, and it's about Bukovina. It's about Chernivtsi, and it's about how people there deal with the say cultural diversity of the past and various attitudes to the multicultural past of this province. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Niklas. And dear our viewers, you just watched our program called Freely and Critically, conducted by Gintautas Mažeikis and me, Tomas Kavaliauskas, senior researchers from Kaunas Vytautas Magnus University, Social and Political Critique Center. Once again, thank you to our special guest, Niklas Bernsand.
Thank you very much.
We hope to meet you.
Nice talking to you.